All right, everybody. I have a special person on this podcast today, Christine Sison with Swiss Monkey, and we're going to talk about remote talent, which is
Yes.
actually a big conversation right now. I see these remote companies popping up at the sponsorships events and that we do. And you know what? I was really curious to bring somebody like yourself. You've been around since 2016 doing this, and I want to talk about remote talent. And maybe let's start with, like, what is it something that people don't get about remote talent, like in 2025?
I think one of the things is that outsourcing is not new to dentistry. We've been doing this for a long time, right? People think of outsourcing like, let's go to the Philippines, let's go to India, but outsourcing typically billing companies. This is not new. I think what ended up happening in dentistry is after COVID, a lot of people didn't go back to dentistry. And then a lot of doctors that typically are like, hey, I want to do everything on site. All of a sudden, there's just not enough people working. Even now, we have 2 to 3 times more many jobs than we have people. So now you have to think about how the hell am I going to run a dental practice when there just aren't enough people to work, right? And so the idea is you're kind of backed against the wall and saying, okay, where are there people? And I think also with the generational gap of kind of the millennials and Gen Z that are like, hey, they want to work remote, they want to work from anywhere, they want to have different like employers. There's kind of this really interesting convergence of like where the labor market is, what private practice needs, and kind of, can we actually do it? Now technology has actually been reduced where you can have someone 3,000 miles away, remote into your office for a cheap price and do it in a HIPAA compliant way. So I think remote work's definitely changed. It's much more accessible now. And what's fantastic is we're learning how to do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice the patient experience. Because when you used to, we were like, oh, I don't want Tiger to answer my phones. He doesn't know my patients. He doesn't know my brand. And I think if you slow it down and you kind of really work through the workflow, you could do a better job than some of the on-site people and give the on-site people time to do their job really well, and you do your off-site piece really well. So there's definitely a way that you do this, so it's there you can still create the magic of the patient experience.
Okay. And then when it comes to pitfalls, like, I'm thinking sometimes if I'm a dentist, like I'm a control freak, and I have somebody at the front, like they do treatment coordination and scheduling and all that. And like just thinking that I'm going to bring somebody remote and I can't sit them next to me to train them. Like how does that work?
Oh, absolutely. So um, there's definitely ways to think about that, right? Because you're not, when you bring in somebody offsite, there's an onboarding process because you work with every practice is different. They all schedule differently, they take different deposits, and I think what the misconception is like, oh, I'm going to bring in Christine and we're just going to plug her in, and you forget that it's just like another employee, right? It's another team member here, and you have to still do the onboarding process as if they were like your on-site team. And so I think that's the piece there. Like there is kind of an orientation that you need to make sure like, hey, this offsite person has what they need to be able to schedule properly. They know what our protocols are. There's transparency. So part of what we've done is we've kind of created some technology between the office and the remote person to say, hey, here's what Tiger's doing 10,000 miles away, right? Here's what he does at the end of the shift. And then we just allow us to be able to communicate regularly. So there's a variety of tech that allows it to seem like you're not necessarily, many thousands of miles away. You're just next door and I can't see you. So there's tech that can kind of bridge that gap. But that's certainly something that, if you're just going to like say, okay, I'm just going to hire Tiger and he's just going to come in here and it's going to be great. That's where I think things fall. And so you have to be very deliberate. And I think companies like ours, we've been doing this for so long. We will say, okay, doctor, if you want to do this, here's what we need to do. And we need certain things in place so that this is going to be successful, because it can absolutely fail. And you have to be very careful about what you're outsourcing, right? You don't want to outsource the most difficult thing in your office. Like if I'm a doctor, I'm not outsourcing unscheduled treatment to someone who doesn't know my patients, right? You're trying to outsource the things that are taking up a lot of time. That doesn't make sense for me to pay someone in California $35 an hour plus benefits to like sit on the phone with my favorite insurance company for 45 minutes and then get a breakdown versus like providing patient care. So you have to think about the workload, and then you have to start to kind of parse out what doesn't make sense for my team to do on site, and the things that aren't patient facing, can we push that off site? So it's, you kind of have to be thoughtful about it. And I want to be clear here. Just because you can offload it to an offsite person doesn't mean that you should, right? It's not like everything that's done, like it's not patient facing. You have to kind of work with your team a lot of people are very nervous about like, oh my gosh, Tiger's going to talk to my patients. He doesn't know what we do. And so a lot of on-site team members are very nervous about it. And you have to really be deliberate that these people are not here to take your job. They're here to like free you from doing stuff that you don't like doing that has to be done in a dental practice so that you can do the things that someone offsite can't do, which is like checking out the patient, providing a really great patient experience, right? Like the last thing you want is someone coming in and I'm like, can you wait, Tiger? I'm on the phone with blah, blah, blah. Then, my insurance here to get a breakdown. So we're really helping practices understand how to apply the model so that they do it well. Because it's not just like, all of a sudden you're remote and it's done. There's a bunch of like, pieces around technology, transparency, accountability, quality assurance that happens even after you onboard.
Can you give some of those examples? And you mentioned like now you have the technology to know if your team is working or the
Yes.
remote people are working.
Absolutely. So let's just say you're outside. So one of the things you have to, unless it's a cloud-based software, that person has to remote into your office, right? So we want to make
Hmm.
sure, at least for us, we don't want things leaving the office. We want all the patient files and all that stuff staying within kind of the workstation within the four walls of the office. So we remote in. And then we have a bunch of HIPAA compliant software that allows the person offsite and person onsite to communicate. So real-time messaging. Super important because if I'm answering your phone, I'm like, hey, Dr. Tiger, Melissa's on, and I'm looking at your schedule. She's an emergency patient. There's no block. What do I do? So I need to be able to message the front office team like, hey, guys, I have an emergency patient, blah, blah, blah. So that messaging component is really important. And in addition, we have a couple of things, a productivity platform. So we have a special platform where at the end of the shift, all of our team members actually have to submit a productivity log to say, hey, Dr. Tiger, here's what I did today. I sent $3,000 worth of claims. I scheduled $10,000 worth of cosmetic treatments. I sent XYZ. It's fantastic for a doctor to get a sense of like, hey, I spent $1,000 on this person, but what was my ROI, right? So you want to create some metrics around like, what does this look like? And our professionals love it because then if they ask a raise, they can say, hey, this is why I want to go from $20 an hour to 25 because look, last month I scheduled $20,000 worth of Invisalign treatment. So it kind of creates the emotion around out of like those kind of negotiations that for us, most doctors are like, oh, I like Tiger. He's been here for like last 5 years. He's really nice. People like him, yada, yada. Now we can use basically data, right? It's like, great, I'd love to give you a raise. Let's see what you've done. And let's figure out how to get you to where you want to make $40 an hour. Most practices want to pay their people more, but it has to make my financial sense. And so I think part of it is like, how do you help a professional document what they do so they can have a really strong conversation around, whatever their increased salary rate is. I think we also take we take screenshots, we actually measure like keystrokes. So it feels a little Big Brotherish, but I think the idea here is when you think about remote work, we can't shy away from the fact that most people are like they don't know what you're doing offsite. Like, how do we know? Like, I think it's on the burden of the person that's working offsite to prove to the onsite team I'm actually doing work. And if you kind of like really lean into that, there's a ton of tech now that will allow your offsite team to actually be more. You'll see what they're doing more than what your onsite team is doing.
Interesting. Did you have any doctors come to you and say that productivity log that you have for the remote person, can I have it for the rest of my team?
We have a lot up with coaches also, where it's like, because my husband's a dentist, and so part of it is, when you ask the team to do more, they're like, we need more time, we need another person. And I think sometimes when you ask them to document like what they're doing, you're like, wait a minute, you guys, why do we need another person when you only have like 5 calls in any given day, right? Or like we're not doing XYZ. So I think when people have to document what they're working, they just tend to be more productive because like, man, I worked 10 hours or 8 hours today and like I only made 3 calls. Like that doesn't look right. Like what else did I do? So sometimes the exercise of having to document actually creates, it can feel nerve-wracking if you aren't producing. But I think we need to use that as a tool to be like, let's help you get more productive, right? Because I'm like, look at Tiger, in 8 hours he did this many calls versus you, maybe not as much, but like maybe that's just because your calls are, maybe your output is more per call or whatever it is. So it's not, we don't want to look at the data on its own, but it's certainly information to help us have a conversation with a team member.
Yeah, I really like the framework, the way you said, let's help you get more productive. So it's not, we're measuring not to beat you down, but like to help you grow and actually keep track of your growth. What are some other pitfalls that you see when people try to go and implement the remote team?
So I would say one, they don't have good workflows inside of the office. So one of the things that happens when you have a team member come in whether it's onsite or offsite, is that you have to have pretty good systems. And especially if you can't see them and they're answering calls, like I need to know like how you schedule. And a lot of doctors are like, just schedule them anywhere. Like, it doesn't matter. And then it's like, that's where things fall apart, because you're like, wait a minute, like you only want 2 new patients a day versus 3 versus, on Thursdays after 3, you have 1 dental assistant. So we have to have really great workflows in terms of like how you schedule, what your protocols are for like writing off, certain things in the office. What happens if the patient hasn't been in a year? Is it going to be a new patient? So there's a lot of things where the doctors just kind of assume people know, but it's just every practice is so different. So we force a doctor to say, hey, tell us how your practice actually runs. We actually put all of that workflow inside of our platform. So one of the really interesting things is we're able to memorialize actually the operations of a workflow. Because if you think about it, what ends up happening is like doctor opens up his practice, he hires his office manager who's been there for 10, 20 years, and that person knows everything. And then the person leaves. All that intellectual property around your practice is gone. And so now
not just that, passwords, credit cards, everything.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And we've had this happen. I mean, it's the nature of small business, right? We don't have, I think you and I were talking about enterprise clients where the layers there of management, we just don't have it. We're very lean as it is. And to be overstaffed is super difficult. So it's, how do you create continuity of data from one person to another? So we try to do that with our technology. And I think for us too, sometimes we need 1.5 people in the office, and it's hard to hire fractional people. And so with remote talent, you can say, hey, Tiger, I just need someone for 10 hours a week just to do outbound hygiene recare calls, right? It's super important. You need that. But, typically if you didn't have a remote person, you're like, all right, who's going to leave their full-time job to do 10 hours of work for me? So now you can really start to create a very kind of Goldilocks staffing model where it's like, hey, I need 1 person and 26 hours a week to do X, Y, Z. And now it's possible. Before you're either 1 person or 2 people, and trying to find a fractional person is really hard on site.
And you actually touched on this a little bit, but I want you to go a little bit deeper. When do you think it's not the right time or not the right office to bring the remote team?
When it's super busy. I mean, because we have to almost slow it down when we integrate. I think the offices, they've got 20 specialists going on, and there's nobody that can orient an offsite team member. I think that's where it actually gets really bad, because you're already very busy. And if you can't slow it down for a week or so just to kind of orient a person, now we're just setting somebody up to fail, because now you can't train them. You're assuming that they know what they're doing, and it's a bad mess for everyone. And then all of a sudden you're like, I wonder why it failed, right? And that the reality is usually
they probably blame it on you.
Yeah, exactly. And the reality is most practices, we don't have training programs, right? So I get it. So part of what our job is I need you to slow down. I need you to open up a couple of it doesn't have to be a long period of time, but we need to know there's going to be an orientation process, and we have to give, we have to allow that offsite person to succeed, right? And I mean, when I was running an office, I would be like, just go. But the reality is we're not setting them up to succeed, and we're like, why did it not work out? And I think it's just it's part of when you're the CEO and the clinical surgeon. It's part of running a business. You got to slow it down so that you can allow kind of these types of models to actually be successful.
Yeah. I'm curious, how would the onboarding look like for you when you onboard the customers? It feels like you have to almost sit down and evaluate their business to be very honest with them and just say where they at, how you can help. I'm just really curious on that.
So most of the time they come to us, someone left, someone's gone, their hair is on fire. And typically that person is this is what they did. They answered the phones, they audited the schedule, they did claims, etc. So then we can just fill the roles. And I typically what is the job to be done? Because you're not necessarily have to outsource the whole role. You might say, look, your on-site team member can do X, Y, Z, and why don't we just outsource the really time-consuming tasks and keep these other jobs to be done kind of in the office? So we kind of work with the office to figure out what they want and what they need. Right. And so it's sometimes we kind of parse it out. And it also very much depends on the person on site, because if you have a really strong team member, you might not need a lot of offsite support, right? You're just I just need someone to answer the phones, take a message, don't touch my schedule. But what happens if I had a doctor, for example, brand new startup, their office manager left, and now they hired someone with no dental experience, but they were just very kind, great customer. And we have that great customer experience. They're really eager. but they don't know anything about dental. And so in that case, we say, okay, why don't we pair you up with someone very senior offsite and we will train you, right? But when you think about the makeup of the team, the first scenario I just mentioned, the team member is very, like, doesn't have to be very strong. It's just taking a message. That could be a low level $10 an hour kind of role, which all they're doing is taking a message and then passing it on. Versus in the second scenario, I need to pay someone a lot more because it's a very heavy experienced team member. So your kind of your offsite team is very complementary to your onsite team. So it's highly reflexive, right? So you might just say, hey, the first 2 years, I just used someone that like didn't know dentistry at all, took messages, and all of a sudden my office manager left, and we had to flip that whole thing around. And so what's great is that the talent pool that we have has tons of experience, and so you can kind of like tap into it as you need to.
I'm just taking notes. This is so
Yeah, I know
interesting.
it's a very I think what we've done is, someone had mentioned, I like the term they use, kind of liquid staffing, right? The ability to kind of pick and choose as you need to. Typically, this model is reserved for like large enterprise clients, multi-site locations that have the ability to kind of put together team members. Say, okay, your office manager's gone, no word. Let's pick from location number 35, and we'll bring her over here. In a private practice, when you're very like you're already lean and you need a resource, something like this is a game changer because now you're not alone. You can say, okay, I have, whatever, my team member, and if something happens, I can plug into Swiss Monkey, use that person in the interim. And then when I hire someone, then you can kind of like maybe transition the other person. So we started to democratize how people operate a dental practice. And it's a beautiful thing. I mean, we've had practices. This is the story I like to tell. We had an office. It was a couple, husband, wife, had a practice for 30 plus years. On Monday morning, the dentist came in after a week vacation, and there was 5 letters of resignation on the desk. There was it wasn't even people. They just the team had resigned. There's 2 clinical staff. And you can imagine coming back from vacation. And I know this is probably a cultural thing. Like, people just don't resign out of nowhere. There's probably other things happening there. But you can imagine running a business, you come in and there's just 5 letters of resignation. And in something like that, we were able to, in a day, connect them to team members, answer their phone calls, audit the schedule, move the schedule out until they were able to find people, and then move things back in. That wasn't possible
Wow.
before. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
that's a kind of a break the class scenario. But I think that, every dentist has had that where you come in and it's like something you don't expect.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I always say like you always know someone who got it embezzled,
Oh,
and you always know someone who had like almost like entire team leave
I
with like a short notice.
oh yeah, I think it's like part of like it's like almost part of the it's like the part of the journey, right? It's like, oh, it's it can you almost have to have the stomach for it, really. Just in
Yeah.
entrepreneurship in general, you've got to have the stomach
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. That's amazing. I would say we're so if someone is looking at different companies, obviously there are other resources available, but I would assume that one of the key differentiations would be where your remote staff is located, right? So like I'm sure there are companies that go overseas, which is nothing wrong. Maybe you also do go overseas, or it depends on the skill level that you're looking for. How do you guys structure that?
Yeah, that's a really great difference. So, 98% of our team member are U.S. based dental professionals. So they're people who've worked in dentistry before who have wanted to who want to work from home. So ours, I think that's probably the largest one. Is ours are primarily U.S. based workforce. We can go overseas, absolutely, but I think that's the biggest piece is that we've taken people who've worked in dental practices who want to continue to support their industry, and they're based in the US. But we do have an overseas team because you and I talked about there are some tasks that, for those practices that are looking for the most economical way to get something done. It's not patient facing. Sure, like why not? Right? Like that's absolutely makes sense too. So I think it's like just kind of picking and choosing what makes sense for your practice. I think most practices, most 1 or 2 doctors, it doesn't make sense to kind of segregate it too much because it's like usually the person is like they're doing insurance verification and they're outbound calls, right? So they're also patient facing and they're doing not patient facing things. So it makes more sense to just get one person. But I think as you get larger, and you see this kind of with our enterprise clients, is they start to create like divisions. Here's a verification team, here's a scheduling team, here's a hygiene team, etc. Most private practices, they don't necessarily need that level of segmentation. It becomes too clunky, and it's like in terms of the coordination.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you need to, or do you make it part of the, I don't know, internal processes for your team to stay up to date with technology or anything new? Like I would assume like If
Oh,
Open Dental or anybody launches something new, like your team needs to know before they go and they do remote work for an office, right? Like,
oh,
how do you guys keep up with that?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you're not, I mean, can you imagine what AI is going to look like and how that's going to support just like workflows in general? I mean, the impact is kind of a little bit unknown. I think it's going to be very significant though. And so absolutely we have to kind of keep pace with that. And I'm really focused on like not just I think people need to bring value to dental practice, right? And so I think we typically are basing human capital on an hourly rate. And I think and our goal here is that if that's traditionally how doctors are like, hey, I'm going to pay Tiger $25 an hour. Our goal is like, how do we make your $25 an hour the most impactful, which is like giving you tools to, instead of doing outbound calls one at a time, maybe we give you something that just voice drops, excuse me, right? Something that will accelerate the impact that you're doing in any given hour. And there's a ton of tech now that allows one person to do 10, 20 times more work. And I think that's something that like every professional needs to be kind of stay ahead of, right? It's like if you're just trying to go old school and like you're just using your kind of your with no tools, you're gonna be outcompeted by companies and other people that are like, hey, let me use these other tools to just accelerate the impact that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think dentists and dental assistants are kind of safe from AI, but
Yes,
everybody and
I think for
hygienists.
now, right? For now, absolutely. And I mean, can you imagine? I don't think I want like a robot like hanging over there. I'm like, all right, just a needle shot, just make sure you get it in the right teeth,
Yeah,
I guess. So, yeah,
yeah,
we're not quite there yet. We're not quite there
yeah.
yet.
But everything else, like, it is just nuts. Like last week, I was playing with a tool that you can basically build the whole web app just off of the chatbot, and it's
Absolutely. And
pretty good.
it's so
So
crazy,
imagine what
right?
can be done. Yeah,
Yeah, like can you imagine like you're calling a dental office, you speak to like a robot, and do you even know it's AI? Pretty soon it can actually sound just as good as somebody else, right?
right,
I mean, I don't
right.
even think people talk. I mean, most of the time people are texting, so that's like it's already kind of equalizing the playing field a little bit. So
Yeah,
it's certainly kind of it'll be interesting to see where dentistry falls in next year.
yeah. And probably with AI, probably would do a much better job answering the phone calls than your average person. Is like if you look at the average statistics of a dental practice, like how many phone calls actually answered, how many phone calls actually turn into like scheduled appointments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just did a post like 30% of calls are not answered. And of the 30%, 75% aren't ever returned back. Right. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for like an AI receptionist. Here's the thing though, is that a lot, and we do answer calls, so I can tell you this is true, is that part of the challenge with making those things work is that the actual office has to have like a scheduling protocol. And we don't, most of them don't. They're like, this is
Right.
kind of how we schedule, but if a patient really wants it, you can move it around. So it's like,
Yeah.
you have a template, but then you don't, and it's a little bit, it's super messy, right? So, we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot as the industry a little bit. So I don't know. I guess it's good for humans.
Yeah. Until they tell AI, just go figure out my mess in
Yeah,
my
so we can
schedule,
answer
come
AI.
up with the logic behind it, and use that logic. So,
Yeah, exactly. Just move it around as you need to.
yeah, that's so funny. So, when somebody wants to work with you, like, what are the first 2 to 3 steps that you guys take with a company or with a
To,
dental
to
practice?
Yeah, so for us, what they do is they basically submit like their work to be done. And then we actually automatically start to match them with candidates. So it's a very easy process. They go onto our website. It takes like 2 minutes. They give us a job description, and then within usually a day or two, we start to match them with candidates. And what's fantastic is that because we connect them to remote talent, we're able to fill jobs usually 2.5 times faster than on site. So speed to talent and speed to onboarding is like very fast. Usually, most of my offices interview less than 5 people before they get started. So if you're in real dire straits, this can absolutely be an option. It doesn't mean that you should. I mean, some things I like dentistry to be very personal. I want someone to be in the office, right? But what happens if like we had a practice in like Hawaii where it's just really tough to get people out there? And what are you going to do? You're just not going to have somebody for like 6 months. So idea is like this could absolutely be kind of a stopgap while you're kind of waiting for the right person. So for us, go to the website, or you can, they probably can email or contact us. They give us a job description and we start to connect them to candidates really within a few days.
Fantastic. And so, what would you say start to finish if somebody needs, I don't know, insurance verification person? Like, what would that take? Like from
Start to
submitting.
finish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say on average, the onboarding time between like when they post a position, when they interview. So typically the longest, actually the interesting part is the part that takes the longest is the doctors usually want multiple people to interview. And that's the hardest part. That takes about a week. And then once they select them, it's like 2 days later. It's like, it's very quick because we actually have to implement it. So it takes another day to actually install the technology. So there's a bunch of things that actually just have to be kind of the infrastructure needs to be in place. But the people are there. We actually have more people ready to be mobilized than there are practices, which is good. But typically the bottleneck tends to be on the doctor saying, oh, I want to interview a couple more people. And I thought I wanted them just to do verifications, but I also want them to do this. So sometimes there's scope creep, which is fine. But that typically is kind of what extends the timeline a little bit. Or they're like, oh, I have access to all of these different wage variations because my California doctors, they're like, oh, I don't have to pay someone $40 an hour. I can pay someone this. So now they're like really excited. So now they want to interview more people, right? So it's interesting how you have, when you take out the geography gaps, right? And now you have access to talent. I mean, really you can do global talent. It puts a lot of pressure on professionals because here's the thing, and I tell the professionals this, it's great to work from home. But what you will signal to doctors is that if your job doesn't have to see patients, basically like you're competing in you have a global landscape, right? Like you have to be better than the next person that's charging $10 less than you that has lower wages. So there's definitely some pressure on professionals to be really good, right? Because if I can get the same talent at half the cost because they're living somewhere else, that puts a lot of competition on talent, right? Which is, I think, is not necessarily bad, but it's certainly something where like we make sure like our professionals understand that that's part of what you're signing up for. So if you want to work remote, you're telling me that I don't need to see you to get this job done. You're now competing against someone, and sometimes someone in the Philippines at $6 an hour, right? So you
Exactly.
do have to add
Yep.
whatever that edge is for you.
Yeah. And it's not just that. I mean, if we go down the list, like now instead of W-2, I'm paying somebody as a company. I would assume they're paying your company, right? So that's like, it's not a W-2 expense. I don't have to worry about the
That's good.
taxes.
Yes,
It's just an
absolutely.
expense that I'm paying out. So that's easy. Second is like, if it didn't work out, I don't have to sit and worry about the severance package and all that
Yes,
stuff. So
yes,
basically, to wrap up what you said, like, I, as a dentist, as a business owner, could sit down, think about my org structure, which might take you an entire Saturday instead of going playing golf with your buddies or like doing a brunch with your girlfriends. Like you could like literally sit down, think about like on a paper draft, like, okay, clinical, it's easy. Doctor, hygienist, dental assistant, sterilization techs, done. Like that's easy. Think about the front, who does what, start typing job descriptions, go to ChatGPT and
yes.
say, give me a typical job description for a treatment coordinator at a private dental office. It's actually going to be pretty accurate. Like, do all these as a starting point, tweak it a little bit, and then you have a great foundation. Like, then call you and say,
Absolutely.
give me 2 to 3 candidates. And you could probably do like, give me one overseas, give me one here so I can see the difference and decide for myself. And then
That's right.
for maybe same price or lower, I get less headache. I get somebody who is hungry, like
Yes.
will not have a
Absolutely.
Friday COVID, as my friend likes to say. It's like
Monday
it's
COVID.
Monday COVID. Yeah, okay, that's better. Yeah, because Fridays they're closed anyway.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
am I looking at it from a wrong perspective?
No, I absolutely, that's exactly how it works. And I think a lot of doctors typically it's like they do that exercise or they go to their team and just say, hey, we're producing $100,000 this year or this month. I want to produce $150,000. How do we do that? And then you just be quiet and you let your team think if they can get you to produce $50,000 more without adding any overhead, you should do it. But typically what ends up happening is that doctor's like, hey, Dr. Tiger, I would do that, but I can't because I'm answering the phones, or like I can't call, they have basically a list of stuff that they can't produce more for you because they're doing all these administrative tasks that are taking too much time. And then once you get that list of things, then you can say, okay, Christine, my team says they don't have time to do this. Can we have somebody do it? So you can almost have like the team, your front office, say, hey, if I were to give you an assistant, so that you can go back and call all of my unscheduled treatment that needed all these big cases, Like, what would you want this assistant to do? And that way you can almost like co-develop a team without the doctor feeling like I'm just shoving this extra person down your throat. I like it when the doctors actually work with the office managers, say, hey, I want you to do your best work, and I don't want you doing things that aren't a good use of your time. Like, what can I do to help you make me more money without so that, and give you more joy in your practice, and give me that list. So then the office manager is like, oh my God, I hate doing hygiene weekend calls. I hate doing verifications. I hate doing insurance and aging follow-up, and they can just give you the list. And you'd be surprised. A lot of my offices are using these people 2 to 3 hours a day, just 3 to 4 days a week, fractional. It doesn't need to be a full-time
Yeah,
team member. If you just be
that's the
like, hey,
beauty of it. Yeah,
let's give back 20 hours a month back to your team, maybe just to breathe, maybe get a little joy back. And you can imagine it's $1,000 extra, but then all of a sudden your top line should go up $5, 10, $15,000, right? So it's not just adding an expense to your P&L. You want to think about, if I add this extra person, how much is my top line going to go up? Because at the end of the day, we want to talk about the margin. Like, are we actually profitable? The last thing you want is to add an overhead, add a remote person, then you're producing the same amount of money. Like, what is the point of that, right? Because
yeah,
everyone's going to ask for more team members. Like, yeah, let's get someone to do verifications, and then the doctor adds more people, but then all of a sudden you're not producing anymore. So what's the point?
yeah. And I hope you don't mind me saying this. Like, there's little caveat that I want to add to what you just said. Like, for the doctors to go to the team and say, how do we produce more this year? I've seen so many things that I would just be a little more self-aware and
Yes.
like assess your team in your head first.
Yeah, to see whether or not you
And
I get it.
like to have the right team to ask those questions, because it's possible that your team is not ready. Like, they might be staring at you and not knowing what you mean, or they might be staring at you saying like you're going to take advantage of them. Like, just be mindful about that question, which
Yes,
is I fully support, but like be self-aware about where you at in your practice.
yeah, I
And
think
just
you're right. The teams come in a lot of different flavors, and so you just
correct.
you want to be able to be careful. It sounds like you've heard some stories.
I have seen some stuff too. So I have a lot of dentist friends. So it's been fun.
Yeah.
All right. So I would, for some reason I wrote it down. I'm just curious. And you mentioned somebody, you touched on it, but how would you measure performance of a remote team member?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So typically it depends on the role that they're doing. So that's why when we have the productivity platform, the doctors are going to be the ones that are measuring what the outcome is, right? So typically if it's like you want to say, hey, if they're sending out claims, you want to have like 99% collection rate or whatever that is. So typically they're kind of like KPIs should be already, set for the benchmarks for that practice. But that's usually between the doctor and the team member. So it kind of depends on the role. The idea here is that productivity platform, which is what we provide, gives them the ability to track it. But the doctor actually and the team are going to be the ones that are going to be deciding what is the specific outcome for that role. Because sometimes my doctors are like, hey, this is a part-time project. It's 2 months. I have $500,000 of aging. I just bought this practice. I want to bring it down. And that's a very specific rule versus like, hey, my office is closed during lunch and your job is just to answer the phones. Right. So that maybe that in that case is like call rate. And sometimes it's like, hey,
Right.
hygiene recare is at 80%. I want to bring back as many recare patients as we can. Obviously, that's a full team effort, right? So maybe when you think about how do you measure that, that's different. It's not just like how many calls I make, but it's also, is the doctor actually providing value in the chair? Are you scheduling to make sure they don't cancel? That tends to be a little bit more of a long-term metric. So, we can certainly help in terms of like, how do you actually identify whether or not that person is doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Got it. Okay. And then I'm just curious if you can, totally you can bypass this question, but like, what are the challenges you're facing as your business as you continue to grow? Like, if you
Um,
would have an honest conversation with a
yeah, no,
doctor
that's
and
the
they're
honest
like, yeah,
doctors. There is a lot of inertia in dentistry, and when I think of like remote work, I mean, this industry is we're very conservative. Like, we want the blueprint that was sent to us 20 years ago when we started this dental practice, and you told me it was going to be like this. And all of a sudden, we've got like reduced reimbursement rates. We've got a bunch of technology. Labor is getting expensive. People don't want to work at all. People want to work 3 days a week. I think the generations are expecting. I mean, the millennials and Gen Z, I think, are the big. It's totally changing the way you run a business because they don't want to work full time. They want to have various kind of like gig, other jobs. They tend to not have as much emotional kind of sophistication because they're always on their phone in terms of like, so it's like the ability to have a conversation with somebody tends to be not as like strong as most people want. And so I think for us, our biggest challenge is having them understand how this model actually works, because they're like, I don't get it. Like, I don't get it. What do you mean you're going to answer my phone? How do you answer the phone? And so it's educating the doctor like, oh, guess what? We can actually work with your phone company, triage it out. And then someone from home, as long as they have a HIPAA compliant workstation, can actually answer it and remote into your, to your computer. Like, how do you remote in? And you're like, oh, so I don't need to mail you these things. So it's, I think, creating like helping them look under the hood as like how the model works, because it's like, I don't know, like what if a check comes into the dental office and I have to post it? What do? Well, you got to scan it in and then you got to put it. So there are certainly some things that are, maybe not as easy to transfer over to remote professional. But our job is like, one, how do you do it? What can you do? And how do you increase the chance for success? Because a lot of doctors have heard about this, and all they hear are horror stories. We've all heard it. Just kind of like dentists have like the old reputation. Oh my God, dentistry is like very, when you go into dental office, it's painful. Similar for remote work. It's like we're basically building a brand new narrative around like, guess what? This can be done really well if you kind of slow it down, and we take the steps to make sure like we're doing everything properly. Because there's a lot of risk, right? In terms of like what could go wrong. But when you get it right, boy, and when you get it right, things are like magical, right? Like, I'll tell you, for me, we had one dentist. They were in a high wage state, and the person was like, "Look, I've been here for X amount of years, and if you don't pay me," and it was probably 2.5 times what she was getting paid. "If you don't pay, I have to go. Like, I'm gonna walk." And it was basically like you felt like you're being taken hostage, right? And I think now we can say, "Hey, guess what? We can give you some leverage to be like, look, if for some reason you don't want to negotiate with a terrorist, right? Like, guess what? We have all these other people that can do the job. Now it's going to be different, right? Because they're not on site, but we can at least give you some leverage." Because I've had that done to me. It's like, guess what? We do things in my practice. This is how we do it. And we only do it this way. We're very special. And the reality is, no, you don't, right? It's like there are best practices around how you do it. But I think sometimes people can use that language to make doctors feel really nervous about like, oh my God, I can't lose this person. And then you realize when they leave, like, oh, they were doing all these other things that are probably not the best practice. So I think for us, we're giving the doctors now a little bit more leverage and breathing room to be able to have those conversations without fear. Because before it's like, you'd have to pay that, right? And I hate to use that word taken hostage, but I think a lot of doctors will feel that sentiment. It's like, you're in the clinical side. And like when someone says like, they know all these things and they have all the passwords and they know all your insurance stuff, it's incredibly intimidating when they're like going to pull out the rug around business from under you, and all you know is the clinical side. So I want to let the doctors know, like, look, I've had that happen before. Just breathe. It's going to be okay. And we can always reset the passwords. Like, just take a breather. We can, there's certain things that we can we'll get through it together.
It's amazing. I think the general theme in all of my latest episodes about dentistry is it's kind of hard. It's going to be really hard to be a private practice owner if you have the old model of like, I'm just going to show up, do dentistry and leave. And somehow this thing is going to run itself without me. And it's going to be a really hard model. Like people are going to wake up to a really, really sad story or like a nightmare. But I think for those that like to tinkle with stuff, like move things and not afraid, and like truly builders, I would say, like they're actually going to do really well. And I think from what you've said, like my personal experience, and I always share this with doctors, it's like if you have a team member on your team that's even remotely making it sound like things run because of them, and if God forbid they leave, like it's going to be really bad. That's my first red flag that I need to get rid of them tomorrow, if not today. Because now I really want to know what's going on that they do so well that no one else can do, and God forbid they live. Like I just want to know. Like I've fired personally with so many people when it got to that point, and then 99% of the time you find out that they're just not doing things the way they're supposed to do, or just not do at all.
Yeah, and it's, our industry is tricky too, because we don't ever give them really training either, right? Like we don't have a really great training program, and it's
In
you
dentistry,
know,
not in your company.
yeah, in our, yeah, exactly, in
Okay.
dentistry, right? So we're, in some parts we fail our employees because we kind of assume they know, and
Hmm.
then we also don't provide them any training, and then we wonder why they don't know what they're doing. And so I'm really, there are a lot of coaches that we work with, consultants, lots of now I think education around how to do it properly that will allow your team to be, to be able to excel in what they do. But yeah, I think when you have team members that are just are creating that kind of scarcity mindset and playing kind of using that kind of language, it is really scary for a doctor. And I'll tell you, when they do leave, it does suck. I mean, it's like let's just call it what is.
For a day.
It's yeah, you're like for one day and then we're fine. Yeah, I mean it's it kind of like takes your breath away for a little bit in terms of like, okay, but it makes you, I think the silver lining when someone leaves is it forces you to make sure, like, one, do you have good systems in place? Like when the next person comes in, like, do you know where all your passwords are? So it forces you to be really, I think, tight, kind of dial into your workflows, which every CEO needs to do. And unfortunately, you don't do it until you have to do it.
Yeah. So I think I try to remember the saying I had, like, it always hurts you emotionally, but it never hurts you financially.
Yes, yes, yes.
Like
It does.
it's gonna suffocate emotionally, but from a financial standpoint and operations, like that person's gone, and now you control your business. Now your EBITDA and your multiple is going to be much, much higher,
Yeah, it's
much
interesting.
higher.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality is, people, it's you can't run it, you can't have a business just focused on one person, right? Like, I love it when one
Yeah.
dentist tells me, like, the show must go on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And the show
Exactly.
the show must go on, and it feels a little bit harsh, but I think that's also his way of, like, you know what, if they want to leave, they're gonna leave, right? And like, and the
Yeah.
reality is, it's a very fluid, we're in a very fluid industry. We work a lot with people that are, between 18 to 30 years old. Majority of them are women. And during that time, what happens? We get married, we get pregnant, we get divorced. There's a
Kids.
lot of things
Yeah.
happen where, I mean, let's just go, we have it's a very, like, heavily influenced by women. And so, and there's a lot of stuff that happens with us during that time. And so I think the more that we can also create some consistency through kind of staffing models like Swiss Monkey, right? Where it's like, you don't need to do everything remotely, but there, just know that it's available if you need it. And maybe there's, like, you plug it in as you need to, right? And so um, I think that's helpful. And the reality is, right now we don't have enough people. There's just the jobs. We have too many jobs that we have people available. I mean, we have to be really creative about how we're going to get everything done.
Yeah. Well, Christina, on this happy note, let's end. This was a great conversation. I
Thank
think
you so
it
much.
opened up eyes for a lot of people on remote work. I'll connect all the dots as far as like how to find you and things like that. I'll link up in the show notes. But is there anything you want to add, like as a final thought?
I would just say, look, I mean, for some people, it feels really scary. I think let's just sit down, have a 15-minute conversation, at least know that it's available to you, right? It's not for everybody. But I think, when your back's against the wall and your team's really stressed, it's certainly an option that you can kind of explore. And that's what I at least want to let doctors know, like, this model's available to you now, and it can absolutely be a game changer for how you run your business.
Awesome. Christine, again, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Hopefully we'll do a round two,
There we
but
go.
this is it for now. Yeah. Thank
Thanks,
you. I
Tyre.
appreciate
Thanks, everyone.
it. Bye-bye.